Hello, everyone. My name is Neela Klein, and I am here with my collaborator, Elizabeth Ray. And today we're going to be talking to you about pre-registration. We are both consultants and graduate students with the Indiana Statistical Consulting Center. And so we wanted to talk to you about this increasingly important part of research and of pre-registration. So we're going to be going over a lot today, and we're really hoping that this can be something that you can come back to later. So there's going to be a recording of this, and there's also going to be our slides that are going to be available after this. In addition, the chat is currently disabled, but the Q&A is open. So since there are two of us, one of us will always be monitoring the Q&A. So at any point that you have any questions, please feel free to drop it in the Q&A, and we'll be able just to interject along the way. Okay? So just a quick outline of what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be going over what open science is, moving into what pre-registration is, talking a little bit about both the definition and the history, and also why we're doing pre-registration at all. Then we're going to get into a little bit more applied practical side of it. So how does one go about pre-registration on the open science framework, but then also looking at some other templates, specifically looking at the AsPredicted template and some social psychology templates. And then we're going to end with some references and some suggested readings for you to delve a little bit deeper into open science and pre-registration. So Liz has wonderfully set up the slides to be a functional resource even when you don't have us and even if you're not looking at the recording. So you'll notice that this current slide is slightly darker, has a slight gray background, and this was purposeful. So some of the slides are going to be white, those are going to be theory-based slides, and the gray slides are going to be applied slides that have a template for you to reference later on. So if you're using this later on, please feel free just to scroll straight to the gray slides where we have templates for you to use further on for your own research. So let's get started. So pre-registration is a single component of the open science framework movement. This movement is aimed at making scientific research more readily available and disseminating it to all parts of society. So generally, research has historically only been readily available and digestible to folks that have advanced degrees or are part of these prestigious institutions, which makes research not available or able to be integrated into all parts of society. So the open science framework is trying to make sure that research and data and science is available to the masses so that it can be replicated, it can be interrogated, and it can be kind of fact-checked by public more generally. So pre-registration is just a beginning part of this open science framework, and it really falls under this planning stage. But it falls under other subcategories such as data management and team science, where all of these are really speaking together. Where pre-registration starts and ends and these other facets really continue is fluctuating and is really fluid. And you're going to see that as we go forward. So open science is really about accessible dissemination of knowledge, making sure that all folks at all levels are able to access the information. So everyone from a PI in a lab to my grandmother in rural upstate New York should be able to see every level of the science that I do and make it accessible without there being paywalls, without there being institutional logins, and so on. It's also about being transparent. So what were my intentions? What were my expectations? Did those change? And why did they change? And what am I doing? It should also be reproducible. So a study that I run, Liz should be able to read the study and reproduce it on the other side of the country with her own resources without having to talk to me just through the resources that I put on open science. And this really opens the door for collaboration and collaborative networks. Liz is going to talk a little bit later on about how this has led to her having an increasing number of collaborators in her own research. But this is really forming networks across labs and across institutions. Like I said, forming collaborative networks with shared resources. And this is really essential for making science go faster, making it more innovative, but also opening up the door for people to interrogate it, to question it, and to expand on it later. So, okay, we talked a little bit about open science. Let's delve more deeply into pre-registration. So you're going to see this name Nozick often, this citation that I have here of Nozick et al. 2018. Dr. Brian Nozick is one of the founders and one of the driving forces behind the open science movement, and I believe one of the founders of the Open Science Center. And his definition of pre-registration is specifying both the research design and the analysis plan prior to observing the research outcome. So what this means is writing down and publishing your procedures, your participant plan, so on, and all of your methods, and also what statistics you plan to run or how you plan to interpret any of your data prior to looking at the actual data. So this might look different in fields that have qualitative data. So this might look at sharing some common coding schemes for how you plan to show interviews, talking about who you plan to interview and some of the questions you might ask. Or in quantitative fields, it might be sharing the measures that you're doing, how you operationalize your variables. It might talk about what statistics you plan to run, and also who your participants are going to be, how you will determine who is excluded from your data, so on and so forth. So what's the difference between pre-registration and a research design? We had both of those on the previous slide. The research design is the structure of your actual study. So who are the participants? How are they selected? How are your variables measured, manipulated? Are you doing it between subject design, correlational, longitudinal, qualitative, so on and so forth? The distinction is the pre-registration is the documentation of that. So your research design often might exist in limbo and never actually written down until you come to write down the manuscript for the journal. What pre-registration is aiming at is writing the early stages of your manuscript first and foremost before you have the data. And so again, the pre-registration is the documentation of your research design. Right. So I'm going to go over a little bit of the history of where pre-registration came from. And the goal for this is not just to give a history lesson of science, but pre-registration and open science is really a fluid movement and an ever-evolving movement, which means that a lot of times you reach ambiguities for when you should be doing a pre-registration, what should end up in the pre-registration, and there isn't a perfectly set formula. So I think that going through the history of what pre-registration is to understand the intentions can help you make an informed decision later. So pre-registration was born out of an increasing movement calling for transparency and reproducibility within the sciences. This hit sciences really hard in the social field, but it did fall into areas such as genetics and biology as well. And so in the early 2010s, psychology specifically had what we call the replication crisis, in which a large number of really big and really famous studies failed to replicate when other researchers tried to find the same results. And so in 2013, a signed letter was sent to The Guardian by over 80 academics within psychology and neuroscience calling for scientific journals to adopt a pre-registration model. So this was the field attempting to heal itself, seeing a problem within itself, field members seeing their colleagues not do the best science that they could be, and trying to change the field and move towards a better standard of pre-registration and saying what their intentions are in the beginning. And so with this in mind, pre-registration is becoming increasingly expected. Like we said, the crisis happened in the 2010s, and in 2013, that call was put out. And now in 2025, pre-registration is becoming increasingly expected from both researchers and other journals. Some journals even require it. And so that is some of the reason why people do pre-registration. But on the research ethics side of it, pre-registration helps prevent us from doing p-hacking or harking or having a lack of transparency. So going into some of these in a bit more detail, p-hacking is when you tweak the analyses until they're significant. This sounds really bad, but it's really easy to do accidentally. So What if I only analyze a subset of these participants until I find significant results? This might look like I have 3 conscientiousness checks. What if we originally were going to do people that got 2 out of 3 of these right? Let's only do people that got 3 out of 3 of those conscientiousness checks right, and only look at them to see if we have significant results. So changing who the people you're running your analyses on can often be a form of p-hacking. Also, analyzing the data during data collection is a common form of p-hacking. This might look like, okay, we're going to collect 200 participants, and then you collect 200 participants, and oh, our p-value is really, really close to being significant, or we almost have a clear pattern. Let's just collect 100 more. Oh, now the results are significant. 300 was our plan all along, and that was not your plan all along. So p-hacking is tweaking your analyses until you make them significant and then acting as though that was your plan as you go. But another issue that comes up is harking. So hypothesizing after results are known. This is also called fishing. And this gets into some muddy waters. There is nothing wrong with running exploratory studies, but the issue with harking or hypothesizing after the results are known is not showing transparently that your study is exploratory. So fishing around for significant results and then presenting the results as though they are your plan all along. The issue that comes out of this is then you have no way of differentiating what results are spurious or happened by random chance and which results were actually theory-driven and supported and things that would replicate. And lastly, pre-registration ensures that we are transparent, so making sure that we have clear methods, that all of our data is there, and that there's no decisions that are not shown to the public. So pre-registration is increasingly recognized by various academic associations. Liz and I are social psychologists, so a lot of the examples we're going to give are psychology specific or social psychology specific, but we found this across journals and across many other academic associations. So this is right on the American Psychological Association's website. They have a whole section on pre-registration where they are urging scientists to increasingly adopt a framework where they pre-register before they have their data. And this is also then translating into the publishing field. So I'm going to give an example of an article that I recently submitted for publication, and we are luckily just got accepted. So this is from the Journal of Emotion. They have a field expectation around open science. They have a whole section on transparency and openness. And if you go down here, they even have requirements for how studies are pre-registered and how your analyses are pre-registered. And this goes into how your reviewers are considering your article. We've had papers sent back because we didn't explain enough how our pre-registration was shown, for accidentally not including our pre-registration link, things like that. And they're even referencing the same research that we had up there earlier. So many journals will require you to have pre-registration, to have pre-registered your studies, or to explain why you did not. And other journals don't require it, but it might be a boon for when you submit it. They might be more likely to accept it or be viewing it more favorably. And so some examples of how to put pre-registration text into your manuscript I've included here. So this is from the same manuscript that had some studies pre-registered and some studies not. So in our 7-study manuscript, one of our studies, we had this study's design and analysis plan was pre-registered respectively before the data was collected, and then we have our OSF link in here, and that is straight up in the text so that anyone who reads our study is able to access it. But some of our studies were not pre-registered. So our first couple studies were exploratory, and we said that at the end of our method section that this study was not pre-registered. Doesn't take up too much of the word count, and at this point then all of our readers are able to know which of these were pre-registered and which were not, which were exploratory, and which we had more specific hypotheses on. And so we include this so that you would be able to have a guideline for how to include it in your own manuscript, but also many of the journals in their submission guidelines will have exact phrasing for how you should put it in the text. So make sure any journal that you're going to be submitting to that you, that you look at their pre-registration guidelines and see if they have an exact quote that they want you to put in there. Oh, excuse me. All right, so the journals, to acknowledge that you've done pre-registration, that you have your data as open science, will often give you badges. And we're going to talk a little bit later on about what you can do with these badges, but there's various badges for various ways that you've followed the open science framework. So having your data readily available, having your materials readily available, and for pre-registering those different badges. And we have a little bit more detailed explanations here for you to refer back to later. But then OSF also has their own badges for open data, a more restricted version of open data and open materials. Same with pre-registering everything, pre-registering the analysis plan, so on and so forth. So these badges are fun, but what can you do with them? Well, it's increasingly becoming expected that you're going to show these badges at a conference. So this is an example of a title slide that I might give at a conference. So we're just showing how to do the badges here. But on our title slides for something I'm going to be presenting in April, we literally have these badges shown in the corner for our study that we've pre-registered, have open data and open materials for. When you have some studies that you've pre-registered and some that you don't, maybe you only want to show it later on. So maybe we didn't pre-register study 1, study 2, but we did all of that for study 3. Maybe this would just be on my transition slide for study 3. Or maybe I just show it on the method slide when I'm talking about who the participants were, and maybe I only pre-registered and I didn't have open data and open materials yet. So I would only put the badges that are applicable to me, and I just put it in this corner. As silly as it sounds, it's becoming increasingly expected to see these badges at conferences. I've seen folks put them on their posters, and it really gives a field level stamp of approval to some studies, because as more researchers do pre-registration, they know how thorough it has to be to do pre-registration. So how do you get these badges? I believe that when you submit a pre-registration, it should you're never going to get them in the mail. It is a little bit of a trust system. So you can download them from OSF and from the journal's pre-registration site, but it's able to be checked. So if I put it up here that I pre-registered the study, I've had folks in the middle of the conference look up the study online and look for the pre-registration. And they did that not to doubt me, but to be able to find my materials later. So you usually get it from the OSF website. Is that how you usually do yours, Liz?
Yes, exactly. So for papers, that is where peer review will actually ensure that that has been taken properly analyzed by someone who's engaging in the peer review of your work. When it comes to these poster presentations, conference presentations, that is where the honor system comes in.
Yeah.
So exactly.
So early on, it's an honor system, but later editors and reviewers from these journals are going to be looking at them more closely. And you can get dinged a little bit in the field if someone looks for your pre-registration and it's not there. All right, so before we move into tangible steps on how to do your pre-registration, we're going to talk about some common narratives around pre-registration that we've broken up into pros and cons. So it shows credibility. Like I said, a lot of researchers, you're going to see a crowd of nods as you show your pre-registration badges at conferences, and people are more open to hearing your results, especially if they're surprising, if you have those badges and you show that it was pre-registered. It also maximizes how much your data is shared throughout the scientific community, so it makes your data it makes it easier to replicate your data and also replicate your findings. It shows transparency in your work, and it reduces the bias in your research and kind of oh no, I didn't find what I thought I would, let's try and tweak it until I found what I think I would. This prevents you from doing that. And it also facilitates reproducibility. And so Liz is going to talk about that in just a minute in the enhanced collaboration section. So one of the pros of pre-registration is often we have a call to do research and for other folks to replicate our research. And so Liz is going to talk a little bit about her experience in that.
Exactly. So like Neela mentioned, we're a part of a variety of psychology and social psychological communities. Within the social psychological community, there's a variety of shared email threads and email listservs where collaborators can send out emails to be able to reach everyone who has expressed interest in that topic or subtopic of psychology. One of the opportunities that I joined through seeing one of these emails was joining a pre-registered replication report in which a researcher from an international institution sent out an OSF link describing some of the goals that they had for an upcoming study, and they invited us all to join their efforts. So they shared the study materials with us. And from that, we were able to run the study on our own without ever talking face to face with that particular researcher. So it helped facilitate some ongoing teamwork, not only across universities, but also across countries. So it can really enhance collaboration in ways that might not be possible without the OSF framework and other open science frameworks.
So we're having some trouble with our mics. I'm getting a little bit of feedback back here, and hopefully it is not too much translating into Zoom. So like Liz was saying, a lot of collaborators in our field are finding new teams through finding folks that want to do replications of their own research, and just by honing the power of the internet. So just by pre-registering, we're able to find a larger community of folks that do similar work to us. And this often happens, like Liz said, in email chains, in newsletters, so on and so forth. I got an email about one, I think yesterday, for asking for other labs and other research communities to pre-register something in our field, to pre-register and to replicate findings in their field. And so this really gives credibility to the labs that are spearheading this research, because not only are they confident in their results, they did the science as accurately as they can, but they also are actively recruiting folks from the wider community to take their study and do it again and see if they can find the same results. So they really want to make sure that they're putting out truth into the world. So a couple other pros of pre-registration is streamlining the process. While it feels like we're adding an extra step by asking folks to pre-register, in reality, it's steps that you're going to take at another time. So writing out your methods is something that you would do for a grant. It's something you're going to have to do for your manuscript. Writing out what your analyses are also going to go straight into the methods and in the manuscript. So while it feels a little bit like we're adding an extra step, it is work that you would be doing later, and it ends up streamlining the research once the data is collected. It also reduces the pressure to have positive results. There are specific journals that will take in pre-registration, and regardless of whether your findings are significant or null, have agreed, if you stick to your pre-registration, to publish your findings. There's not a lot of them, but it does start to whittle away at this file drawer problem, where folks will propose a study, run the study, and then they get no results, and the studies just end up in a file drawer. Pre-registration also means that there is then a track record of what studies have been done, and this would then prevent folks from double dipping. So if Liz ran a study and didn't find significant results, and then 10 years later I had the same brilliant idea, I can look up the keywords and the pre-registration will come up, and it keeps me from reinventing the wheel and doing what Liz has already done, because I can see that she has pre-registered it, and I could reach out to her to ask what the results were. So this prevents resources from being overly used on the same issue over and over again. And it also encourages diversity of scientific practices. So trying to make sure we have a higher quality, more intense hypotheses, more inclusivity of both exploratory and confirmatory studies, which then goes on to enrich the scientific literature. It also leads to a shorter peer review process. We will talk a little bit later, sometimes peer review can happen in the pre-registration phase, but it shows the researchers and the reviewers all the steps that you did, so that there's less back and forth for, can you explain this? You didn't show this piece, and it streamlines the peer review process. Lastly, it does a good job of distinguishing confirmatory versus exploratory research. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with exploratory research, but we really need to make sure that exploratory research is labeled as such, which is also going to do you well in the peer review process. And it shows separates out research that we already know versus something that is a new finding. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the cons of pre-registration, and you're going to hear me negate a lot of these cons because this is a narrative that is often said for why folks don't pre-register. A lot of people have a fear of scooping, so they think if they put their pre-registration out there that someone is going to read it and take their idea and do it themselves and then get all the credit for it. So OSF shows the date that you pre-register something, which puts a timestamp on of when it was your idea. But also you can pre-register something, have the date on there, and have it be private. So you can have this as a track record of when you started the research, when you came up with the idea, and it works a little bit like a trademark that you had the idea in whatever year you did it. And this can be made either public or private. And it can be made private for while you're working on it, and then you just share the pre-registration when you send it to a journal and make it public then once it's all completed. So other people think that it's going to limit you into a research design that might not fit you for the future. And pre-registration is not asking you to be someone who can predict the future. It's not trying to bind you into a research plan. What they're hoping to do is have transparency in what your goals are for any given project. So what is our design? What is our plan? If that didn't work, that's fine. Most OSF pages have somewhere where you can add in amendments. And a lot of the journals that require you to have pre-registration ask for, did you pre-register? What's the link for it? And did you deviate from your pre-registration plan? And they're not looking to ding you if you write in that lax box that you deviated from it. They're just looking to understand what happened and what's going to happen next. So, okay, we thought we were going to find differences between these two groups on XYZ variable. We didn't, and because we didn't, we went in this new direction. And I would write all that out in my pre-registration or to the journal and explain it to them, and it really would not ding you at all for the review process. Some folks think that this is only for confirmatory studies, and that goes down to, frankly, a philosophy that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. So some folks use this for confirmatory studies and some don't, but the field does not recognize pre-registration as only existing for confirmatory studies. There's a couple of camps that we're about to talk about that use it for exploratory studies, folks that use it for confirmatory, and folks that fit into both camps, and neither is right or wrong. Folks are also really afraid of criticism. So what if I put out my pre-registration and someone finds on the internet and they completely disagree with it? Frankly, that is the same argument that could be made to publishing in journals more broadly. So if you put out if you put something out into the world in a journal article, it can be criticized just the same way as a pre-registration. But like we said earlier, pre-registrations can also be made private. So if that is a really big concern, it doesn't need to be made public for it to still be pre-registered. Lastly, and probably one of the most pressing, people think that pre-registration is a pain and a time constraint. And honestly, I completely agree. Sometimes we just forget to pre-register, or it just doesn't fit into the deadlines that we have. But pre-registration takes up time that would already be used for research. And like I said, most of the things that you put into your pre-registration are going to go straight into your manuscript or into a grant. So it is never time wasted. It's just time allocated earlier versus later. So we're going to end here, we're going to end the background here with some of the types of pre-registration and those camps that I was talking about. So there's a version of pre-registration that is a reviewed pre-registration, which is where you submit a pre-registration to a committee of your peers and they either approve or deny the pre-registration. But the more common version of pre-registration that is not a registered report is an unreviewed pre-registration. This is when the data has not been collected and there's no reviewers involved in this pre-registration, and instead the authors lay out their pre-registration, submit it to OSF, frankly put their pre-registration on the internet, and it is a way for them to hold themselves accountable, and then no one's reviewing it until they submit it to a journal. And this is much more common than the reviewed pre-registration. Now, talking about those camps that I mentioned earlier, we've labeled them A and B. They're not really as defined and as rigid as we put them here, but some folks like to pre-register everything, so they might have study one be exploratory and they'd pre-register study one, they would label it as exploratory. So our study one is exploratory. We include XYZ measures. We're planning to run XYZ analyses, and we think that this is going to happen, but we also are going to include ABC, other follow-up analyses, because this is going to be largely exploratory. And then after they have the results of study one, they would then pre-register their study 2, 3, 47 in a confirmatory way, where they talk about the results of study one and say that they aim to replicate study one in study 2 and 3, and they're a little bit more rigid in what they expect. Approach B is that you don't pre-register study one at all if it's exploratory. So you might run study one without it being pre-registered, and then you pre-register the confirmatory studies for studies 2, 3, so on and so forth, and then again reference the data you found in study one. So you can summarize this by, do you pre-register or not your exploratory studies? And there isn't a right answer. It might be right for your lab or not, depending on time constraints and honestly what your research looks like. Different principal investigators have different philosophies on this, so I would talk to your department about what's expected in your field, but also look to the journals that you're hoping to present in to see if they have strict guidelines for what you do need to do to be submitted into those journals. So now I'm going to pass it to Liz, and she's going to talk through the tangible steps that you can do to pre-register on Open Science Framework and the AsPredicted website.
Thank you, Neela. So to get us started, I wanted to give a quick overview of two of the main and most common platforms that people use to post their pre-registrations. So one of them is OSF, so that's Open Science Framework that we've been referencing. And there's also the AsPredicted website. So something that OSF has been doing is integrating various templates so that other website platforms are also available to be posted on the single OSF website. So as I talk through this today, just know that you can post the AsPredicted template to a website directly called AsPredicted, but you can also use the AsPredicted template within OSF. This is particularly useful if you're going to use a variety of different templates throughout your career. This can have all of your pre-registrations and other OSF materials all housed within one account. So to get us started here, I just wanted to show you what the OSF website looks like here. You can see that within the OSF landing homepage, there's a variety of sub-options here. So there's OSF preprints, OSF registries, OSF meetings, and so on. Today, we're mainly going to be focusing on this OSF pre-registry section under OSF registries, but after you've made one account on OSF, you have access to all of these. So it'll help you be able to create one place under your name where all of your open science materials are available. So the first step to getting started on osf.com is going to the OSF Registries subtab and clicking Add New. Once you click that Add New button there at the top, it will bring you to a new opening page where it's going to begin asking you some introductory questions to get your OSF set up for this pre-registration. First, it'll ask you, do you have content for registering this within an existing OSF project? Basically, what this means is that there's folders within OSF that makes you be able to organize all of your projects across those different subcategories. So say you have a project or a folder within OSF for Project A. Project A might include the registry, it might include some meeting notes, and then down the road it can include your preprint. So many times you just use no in this case, but this is an option for you as you further develop your open science practices to make sure that your internet presence is organized in that way. Next, you'll be shown a variety of different options for templates, and you need to show which template you're interested in by choosing which type of registration. So, like I mentioned, on the OSF website, within this one platform, there's a variety of templates available for you to use. So, all of these are available within any account that you use, and today we're going to be going over two of them specifically to show you a range of the depth and detail that will be requested within each pre-registration. Specifically, I wanted to note that you'll see that there's one option here called open-ended registration. This option will give you a single text box where you can go into as much detail that you're interested in providing and include any attachments that you're curious to do so. As predicted template within OSF is a bit of a middle ground. As you'll see on some of these next slides, it's going to ask you 7 specific questions to help you get that pre-registration posted. There is also much more detailed options available, which will just ask you additional questions and more detailed questions as you go through the pre-registration. So one of those is the pre-registration template in social psychology today. As you'll see, that one goes into a lot of detail, but like Neela said, this is not effort with no good cause. These are all considerations and questions you'd be asking yourself at some point of the research process anyway. All right, so first let's explore the AsPredicted template on OSF. So like I mentioned, this is the middle ground template of OSF. It's going to ask you about 7 questions, and we're going to go into each of those in more detail in the following slides. So I do have some opening instructions here for you, but in general, you're going to follow these steps that I showed you of going to OSF registries, clicking Add New, and choosing the AsPredicted template as the template that you're curious to use. All right, so once you choose the AsPredicted template within OSF, the first question you'll be asked is, has any data already been collected for this study? You'll be given 3 different options for this. One of the options is no data have been collected for this study yet. This is ideally the goal that you have when posting these pre-registration templates. Ideally, the data has not even been collected, so it is completely not feasible that you would have had any opportunity to look at it and do any analyses before posting this pre-registration. A second option is yes, at least some data has been collected for this study already. So this may mean that all of the data is already collected, but you have yet to analyze it or clean it yet. Or perhaps just like Neela mentioned, sometimes the timing doesn't quite line up how we would ideally want it to in the research process. And sometimes you've collected 20 participants and then the time becomes available for you to post a pre-registration. So in cases like that, that's when you would choose that second option of yes, at least some data has been collected for this study already. The third available option for this first question is it's complicated. We have already collected some data, but we explain further in question 8 why readers may consider this a valid pre-registration nonetheless. So again, this third option is going to be appropriate in a variety of cases, one of them being secondary data analysis. So let's say another researcher posted their data on OSF and you're curious to do some additional analysis on that same data set. If you have not accessed that data yet, you can use this AsPredicted template, use this third option of it's complicated, and just explain the parameters of which you're going to be approaching that data set before you open it on your end.
Okay, if I cut in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this question is also super relevant for that uh-oh moment that you might have of, uh-oh, I put the study up already and the data is starting to collect. Is it too late to pre-register? And we really want to dispel this myth that you can't pre-register it later. So I've had a friend who collected the data, didn't even open the data set, and then remembered that she didn't pre-register. And she was terrified that she wasn't going to be able to pre-register and that she'd be excluded from some of the journals that she wanted to submit to. And so what I told her is, no, don't touch the data yet, don't open it. We're going to do what we intended to, which is make sure that we don't pre-register after we've already looked at the data. So don't open the data, go into OSF, and she would have clicked that third option that it's complicated. And I would have told her to go down there and to write out that the data has been collected, but has not been analyzed, has not been opened, and has not been looked at. And in that capacity, she can still pre-register and it's still feasible for her to submit to those journals that had those requirements.
Thank you, Neela. And it looks like we have a Q&A in the chat that I do think that we've partially answered, but just to make sure that we fully address your question, we have, can we register an ongoing or a complete study? So Neela's wonderfully laid out how we can pre-register an ongoing question, but a completed study where you've already did the data analysis is a bit of a different story. I would say in this case, it wouldn't make sense practically, ethically, or just given the whole spirit of pre-registration to do that process after a study has already been analyzed. But I think that this would be an opportunity to either include that as a future direction or including that as a second or third study within that same package. What do you think, Neela?
Oop, I think it depends on the contents of completed study. So I've worked in a lab that's done a lot of, excuse us, mic issues, where we've had a lot of cross-sectional data and a lot of same data sets were used for different purposes. So if you haven't, so let's say that your PI has data and someone who hasn't touched the data before is going to be analyzing it. In that capacity, you could pre-register it under the it's complicated area. But if you're only going to collect the data to answer a certain set of questions, and you've already collected the data and you already know the answers to those questions, then we would not be able to pre-register. I hope that answers your question. And if it doesn't, please make sure that you follow up in the Q&A so that we're able to look at it again.
Perfect. So let's go ahead and move over to the second question that you will be probed to ask if you're following the AsPredicted template. So the second question is, what's the main question being asked or the hypothesis being tested in this study? So here you're going to want to be asking yourself questions like, what specific questions am I trying to answer here? What do you think you're going to find? And these should be specific and testable. So as you'll see in some of the more detailed templates, you will be specifically probed why you're choosing the analysis you're choosing. Which location will those variables be placed in within the models that you anticipate running? So we recommend going into much more detail than is required within this OSF predicted template specifically, but that is just an option you have on your end as the author of that pre-registration. And if you do have more than one hypothesis, you have the opportunity to write multiple within that same text box. So you can include them all within this single question too.
So speaking to the question of the cross-sectional data sets that answer different questions, I'm going to scooch over here. Like I said, if you have cross-sectional data, if a new question that hasn't already been answered is being looked at, you can pre-register that. And so again, you would, for question 1, click that it's complicated button and clarify what's going on. So you'd clarify that this has been pre-collected data, but this is going to be a new hypothesis done by someone that has not looked at the data yet. Or you can write it out in a little bit more detail. It also could be the case that you write it out in more detail and the journal looks at it and they disagree and they ask you to not conclude it. And, that really wouldn't be that much of a problem. You would just delete the link from the manuscript if they don't agree with how it's pre-registered. We also received a question of, can you pre-register a dissertation? Yes, you can. Liz and I are actually personally in that situation right now. And so if you remember those 2 camps of pre-registration, I am currently in the second camp where I have 2 studies looking at novel hypotheses that we didn't have the ability to pre-register, but we're going to be collecting 3 more studies and pre-registering all of those, replicating it. And so in that capacity, I'm doing the second camp. Liz is also working on pre-registering her dissertation. And frankly, this is not too far off from any other dissertation proposal where you would be defending to your committee that you plan to do XYZ analyses and how you plan to carry out your methods. So highly encourage you to pre-register your dissertation. We will be doing that as well.
Related note here, if we have any undergrads joining us who might be doing an honors thesis, or if you're a grad student who works with some honors project students or independent study project students, you can also do this for those sorts of studies and for those projects as well. The same sort of answers to question 1 would apply here. So if you're gathering a new data set for that project with the student or for yourself as the student, you would be able to choose that option where you say, no data has been collected yet. But if you're a grad student who has an undergraduate doing perhaps a secondary analysis on a data set that you already have available, you may be able to tell that it's complicated question or answering a direct that the data has already been collected would be an option there as well.
Another question excuse us, that just came up is in experimental research, how does stimuli pretesting and therefore pilot testing work with those three options? So it depends what you are pretesting and what that pilot data is showing. So let's say you're pretesting to see if people think that face A looks angry, but in the study you're not measuring if face A looks angry, then you would use the no option that you've not collected any data. But if you are collecting data that goes into your main analyses later, then you would click that second option that some data has been collected, if that makes sense. So if it is related to your main questions, you would say that some data has been collected. But if it is a sanity check for we're running a manipulation, we want to make sure the manipulation works, you could either say no or yes, depending on how close it is to your actual question. I will specify that a lot of times there is pilot data that you did not collect. So for example, I use a large database of faces in my research, and those faces have been pre-tested on XYZ characteristics, but I did not run that data collection and those characteristics are not going into my analyses. Then I'm going to click the answer, no, I did not collect any data because the data that's going into our analyses has not been collected yet.
Thank you for adding that. And just another point about pilot testing. I do recommend that if you're doing anything novel with your pilot testing, that there could be some additional side benefits to going ahead and posting a pre-registration if you think anything might come out of that novel approach down the road. So for example, I have been using an experimental manipulation in some of my work that we've did some tweaking based off some additional research that's came out about manipulating that specific variable of interest. And I've decided to actually build a paper out of that manipulation method. So by happenstance having pre-registered those pilot testing, I'm now able to say that those analyses are pre-registered. So just because you make an OSF pre-registration, just like Neela was saying, it can be deleted right out of a paper. It always can just never end up in a paper in the first place. So oftentimes there's no harm in pre-registering something, just to be able to have that base checked off for later down the road. Oh, interesting. Okay, so there might be a possibility of being able to reference some of these open science framework materials as well. So yeah, that's something that we can definitely look more into. That's a great point. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the third question that you'll answer if you're using the AsPredicted template on OSF. So the third question is, describe the key dependent variables, specifically mentioning how they will be measured. So you're going to want to provide the full details of variable x's, variable y's, covariates, anything that you're specifically going to be pre-registering the analysis for. You want to mention what those variables are and how you will be approaching measurement of them. Another note here, if the study is a secondary analysis of an existing data set, specifically identifying the variable names within that available data set is going to be beneficial to you. Not only does that make your pre-registration cleaner and more thorough, but like Neela said, most of the time when you're doing a pre-registration, you're just doing work earlier on in the process than we're used to. So by identifying which specific variables you're going to be using in that secondary analysis, you're just preparing yourself for when that data set actually gets opened up on your end. What was that? I'm sorry. So same for qualitative, Neela is mentioning as well here. Thank you. All right, so question 4. We did have some questions about manipulations and experimental manipulations earlier on, so this is going to be touching on that point here. How many and which conditions will participants be assigned to? So if you're working on correlational research or you just have a study that doesn't have a manipulated component, you can skip this section and it's as simple as putting an n.a here. So that would feel abnormal, perhaps a bit informal than what we're used to when we're filling out scientific documents, but for this case, an NA is appropriate and expected to see on this fourth question if it simply does not apply to the goals of your study. Now, if this does apply to the goals of your study, you're going to want to describe what each condition is, what the differences will be, if you'll have a manipulation check, and so on.
I will also say that If you don't want to write NA, you could also say all participants will see all the same materials and then lay out what the materials are. This is also a good point to explain if you have any random assignment or if materials are shown in a random order. So like I said earlier, I studied faces, so I would talk about all participants saw XYZ faces and they were presented in a random order like Liz is showing up here. Same with if you're randomizing what order people see survey items, so on and so forth. Or if you are interviewing people in different contexts, that could come up there as well. It's however conditions would apply to your research. These are fairly flexible and can be manipulated to make sense with your research. So sometimes the text boxes can be flexible in how you're using them.
That's a great point. So though this template up on the screen currently is oriented for having more than 2 conditions, you can absolutely adapt the same initial sentence and just choose one single sentence for that single condition, as Neela was describing there. This would also be the opportunity where if you do only have one condition, but you're using random assignment at various points within your survey, you can also describe that here as well, just to have that documented as part of the pre-registration. Okay, so question 5 of the AsPredicted template. It's going to ask you to specify exactly which analyses you're going to conduct and how that's going to relate to your main question or hypotheses that you had detailed earlier. So this is likely going to be the longest section of your pre-registration if you're using this specific template. So you're going to want to specify a variety of things within this one single text submission box. So you're going to want to include things like which models will you run, any test of assumptions for those models. If you don't meet assumptions for those, what corrections do you plan to use? And how will you handle missing data? So each of these things are going to be described like further on without this presentation, particularly when we go into more detail of the social psychology template, which I mentioned is much more thorough. So you can include some of those guidelines from further on for these other templates for this AsPredicted template as well. That's part of the flexibility of using these templates. You can add in any additional information that you feel is helpful to have pre-registered and documented before you begin the next steps of that project. A big one here that I do see and notice are forgotten and oftentimes in these pre-registrations are those assumption checks. So a lot of times we're just assuming based on the questions we're asking, particularly if we're using the same sampling methods that we tend to use for our own projects. It's best to still get those explicitly laid out in your pre-registration just so that you do not have any risk of being accused of those things that Neela mentioned earlier, like harking or phishing. So we've provided a couple different templates for you for this analysis section. So I'll go ahead and read through a couple of them for you. To address hypothesis 1, we will run, for example, a linear regression with y variable included as the outcome and x included as the predictor. We will enter whatever variable you're curious of as covariates in the model, and a p-value of less than 0.05 will indicate a significant effect of these variables. Here's a template specifically for noting the assumptions. Again, these would all be housed within the same question block, but you can include as much information as you feel necessary. So we will first test if the assumptions necessary to interpret, for example, a linear regression, are met. If not, we will apply the following corrective practices so that the model is interpretable. So, of course, whenever you're collecting data, things do not always go as you're expected. So even if you have corrective practices planned out and pre-registered within, if this does not go as planned and you need to do another correction or a different approach to your data, given what you see once you open that data and are actually looking at it, this is one of those instances where you'll just describe that you deviated from your pre-registration. Not only is that normal, it's not going to put a ding on your research. It's just simply engaging in open science practices.
Also a really good spot to write out when something is exploratory versus confirmatory. So we will run a XYZ analysis, and then we also plan to run these other 3 analyses that are going to be exploratory. So you might write out to address hypothesis 1, 2, and 3. We have 1, 2, 3 analysis. And then we will also be running these other analyses for exploratory purposes, and you can explain as much or as little as you would like in that capacity.
Great. So let's go ahead and move to question 6 now. So question 6 specifically will ask you about secondary analyses. So you can choose to include exploratory things either as secondary or within those main ones. There is nothing saying that just because something is exploratory that it's immediately delegated to a secondary analysis. This can be theory driven. It can be lab decision made. This can be different decision points can happen here for a variety of reasons that can be field specific or lab specific. If you run other analyses later that you did not include up front, so let's say you think of a secondary analysis once you're seeing some of the patterns emerging in the data. Again, you're just going to run those as you would normally before you were engaging in pre-registration. You'll just explicitly mention that though this was not something you pre-registered, it is something that you find valuable, and here's why, and how does that deviate from what you originally planned. All right, so question 7 is how many observations will be collected or what will determine the sample size? No need to justify the decision, but be precise about how exactly the number will be determined. So I will say, though the template says no need to justify, I absolutely think it is worthwhile to include more information here than is required. So you can include power analysis information here. If you have simulated data, you can put that information here. A couple other notes. If you're using an existing data set and it's not feasible to understand or know in advance how many responses are going to meet your eligibility criteria before you open that data, that's totally fine. You can say things like N equals the number of participants collected minus any participants excluded based on exclusion criteria, further described along in this pre-registration. So if you're running your own data, though, you can specify that you'll stop collecting participant data at N, but you will further exclude participants following your exclusion criteria. So you do not need to have a precise N of what you will end at, but you do need to have some determination set in place to be able to qualify as a pre-registration here. So we have some templates for these different sorts of cases. So unknown N templates. So let's say you were trying to describe like a secondary analysis. Here is something you could say here. Individuals who are excluded based on X will not be included in the analyses. We will not know our final N until initial analyses are run to identify the number of eligible participant responses across all variables of interest. However, our highest possible N can be estimated using the number of participant responses in the overall existing data set. So while N equals blank, some participants will be excluded based on excluded criteria. So thus, we will start with a maximum sample size of N equals, and we'll exclude any individuals who do not or meet the eligibility criteria. Final N will be determined by the number of individuals who meet the criteria listed. Now, what if you need to describe the difference between what's collected versus analyzed here? Here you could say something like, our final sample size for collected data will be N equals. Our final sample size for analyzed data will be N equals minus any participants excluded based on exclusion criteria.
One other quick thing here, a lot of times because gathering participants is an imperfect science and we might not know how many participants we have available, you can also have your criterias listed out here as well. So what I mean by that is you might say, we aim to collect 200 participants, or we aim to collect data until the end of the fall 2025 semester. Those are both perfectly feasible landmarks to hit on, and you would say, we will either collect 200 participants or we will collect until this exact date, and then you do so, or we will look for articles until a certain threshold is met, until a certain time commitment is met, so on and so forth. But you list out what your goal is and then what the time constraints, what the practicality constraints are. Same with if you're looking for participants to interview, we will seek out all of the XYZ folks at this institution who are willing to speak to us. We are hoping for X number of participants, and so on. So it's just listing out what your intentions are, knowing that life happens and it might not be exact.
Great. So there is an optional 8th question within this as predicted template, and it's asking you, is there anything else you would like to pre-register? So you do have the option of putting NA here, but my recommendation would be to always have something here because this is within this template the best opportunity to describe that exclusion criteria. So you could also include things like variables collected for exploratory purposes, any unusual analyses you planned, or perhaps any exploratory measures that you were just now looking at in this first data set. So there's a variety of things that you can include here, but we are going to specifically provide a template for that exclusion criteria because I find this question to be compulsory for these sorts of pre-registrations. So here's an exclusion criteria description template. So you could include things like eligibility threshold scores. For example, you need a score of 16 or higher on a particular screening measure or a manipulation check. There may be exclusions for unequal representation. So for example, you may need to exclude people based off of demographic availability of those groups. So for example, I do a lot of political work. So whenever I sample any kind of sampling procedure I use, actually, I tend to have a solid group of Republicans, a solid group of Democrats, and a comparatively unequal group of independents and those who identify with other political ideologies. So often one of the exclusion criteria that I use if I'm specifically looking at political party and not political ideology is to exclude those who are within that independent group or identifying with another political party. Another approach to this would be to specifically oversample those groups to try to avoid having to do this. But of course, that's just a research decision that you'll make. And it is very recommended to make a distinction within your pre-registration about why that decision is getting made. So there could also be low data quality checks. So attention checks, Neela mentioned conscientiousness checks earlier, or simply reported attention. This is something that I'm increasingly including in my own studies, is a final question saying that this will not affect your data being included in analysis. It will not affect your payment or the benefit that you're receiving as a participant. It's just helpful for me to know on perhaps a scale of 1 to 7 how much attention you believe that you are paying while completing this survey. So for a specific template, you could say individuals who meet exclusion criteria XYZ will be excluded from the present analyses. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at another pre-registration template available, specifically the pre-registration in social psychology template. This one is going to be much more detailed and much more descriptive in the information that you provide. So these slides will be available after our workshop as well as the recording. So I'm going to go through these quickly and have the opportunity for you to look at this information, just have an introduction to the template, but you can come back to the detailed information either as the recorded lecture or as simply the slides through the SSRC website afterward after our workshop. Okay, so if you are interested in really diving into this pre-registration template for social psychology, there is a whole paper available on this. So it's included in our suggested readings at the end, and I would definitely give it a look if this template seems to be the one that will be best used for you. So this pre-registration template has been housed in a very open science way. You can find this open science paper with this open science template housed within its own open science page. So this is something that's available for you regardless of your field, just simply posted to this open science website. So available to you is going to be the paper, the template, a flow chart for this, but we're breaking that all down today. All right, so step 1 of the pre-registration for this template is to include both metadata about this project, so things like what is the title, what is your name? Do you have a copyright for this sort of study that you're pre-registering? But also starting with hypotheses following that. So you will describe just if you have one hypothesis, you can put that here. But if you do have a variety of hypotheses here, you can differentiate them by numbering them, by using a different organization here, whatever you feel makes the most sense for you and your specific research study. All right, so you will also include a variety of information about methods. You'll notice that many of these questions that I'm showing you now include like perhaps 3 to 7 questions that were all housed within one single text box response for the AsPredicted template. There's pros and cons to both, and you may have reasoning for using any of these templates provided. There's also nothing stopping you from downloading the pre-registration and social psychology template from OSF and posting that as an attachment under the open-ended template option. So you can use all of these in the best way that's going to work for you. Do not feel like you need to be filling out a template. You're wanting to make these templates work for you and your goals. Here, some of the specific things it's going to ask you to describe in detail in different text boxes are going to be things like independent variables, dependent variables, third variables. You're also going to describe your planned sample. So for example, for data collection, indicate where, from whom, and how the data will be collected. And do you have any pre-selection rules? So if applicable, describe pre-selection rules. This could be things like seeking out equal gender groups, seeking out a specific race, or a solid representation of various racial groups. If this does not apply for your specific study, you can also put NA here, but for the majority of us, we will have something that we can describe here, even if you're simply describing that you will be collecting from students, if you use a student sampling pool. You'll also justify the planned sample size. So something that is interesting and noteworthy on this one is that it is specifically saying you do need to provide a justification. On the AsPredicted template, it explicitly says the opposite. So this is just to showcase that you can do whatever is most useful for you whenever you're using these various pre-registration options. So one of the things that Neela and I recommended for justifying your sample size, whether or not it's required, is running a power analysis. So running a power analysis can happen through a variety of different available options. So you might be familiar with G-Power or PASS or R-Shiny. There's a variety of ways to run power analysis. All of these will give you some sort of output file, which gives you that information that you need to understand what the power analysis is telling you. So this specific template does suggest and require that you actually upload that information directly. So for example, I'm most familiar with G-Power. G-Power will give me both written and a visual description of the power analysis based on the input information that I give it. And I directly upload that here as a PDF.
If you are not running a power analysis but have a different justification for your sample size, so say another study ran a similar model to you and you're using that as justification for your sample size, this is also where you would put it in. Or if you're saying that we just need enough participants until the means become stabilized, things like that. So even if it's not a power analysis, but you have another justification for how many participants you have, you can put that here as well.
I know that for certain fields, that's definitely where this note will come from. So that's a really great point. All right, so there's also a section specifically for exclusion criteria, and it will give you some suggestions there, some of them including like missing data, failing suspicion probes or attention checks, demographic exclusions, and so on. But given that this is very like field and sample specific, you can feel free to put whatever applies to your specific study in this question here. All right, so analysis plan. Another place where this is noteworthy that on the AsPredicted template, this is all housed within one question. Within this more detailed template here, it's going to break this down. So it's going to ask you what are all of the relevant variables, what statistical technique are you going to be using, so what analysis or models do you plan to run, and what do each of those variables, what role will they be playing in that specific technique? So is that going to be your independent variable, your dependent variable? Are you going to put a median split on it for one specific analysis? All of that information will go here under variable roles. All right, step 6, how will you handle missing data? This is something that's not explicitly asked of you within the AsPredicted template. So you're starting to see where one of the pros of using these more detailed templates, even if you're not specifically within social psychology, it's going to really help you make all of these decisions and have these thoughts and decision points before you collect data, helping you avoid some potential pitfalls or avoiding not being able to run a specific analysis the way that would be ideal for you. So one of those things would be thinking ahead of how will I handle missing data? How can I avoid this? So you're going to want to think in advance of how is this going to relate to not only the analysis you're running, but what are some of the automatic things that are going to happen with the program that you specifically use. So for example, list-wise deletion is pretty common in a variety of the analyses that I choose to run. So that's something that you need to be aware of before you're pre-registering so that you can make that clear in advance. All right, so data collection questions are our 7th step of this pre-registration template. It's going to ask you things like, has data collection begun? Here, your options are going to be no, data collection has not begun. Yes, data collection is underway or complete. And you can go into additional detail if you're answering yes to that question. So if you say yes, data collection is underway or complete, you can go into more detail about the estimated end date of that project. You can put information in this additional comments box about why that might be the case and how you can justify your reasoning that you have not looked at that data yet, and so on and so forth here. All right, so step 8, you've entered all of this information about your pre-registration goals within this template. Next, you'll click review. What will happen here is you will have the option to see all of your inputted information as a single page where you're not able to edit anymore. So you'll see what this will look like more on the published side or the posted side of OSF. And this will give you an opportunity to share with your collaborators, have them do a second check of this. You can look through it in this different format. Sometimes that can help your eyes see different things than it did in the original submission page version. And from here, you will then press register. So after reviewing and after registering, you'll get this window here that is going to give you a couple of different options. So you'll see here at the bottom, the options are make registration public immediately or enter registration into an embargo. So earlier in the presentation, Neela had mentioned the concern about scooping. If this is something that you are concerned about, or if this is more of a concern in your field, you're going to want to be curious about this enter registration into embargo option. This is that option that Neela was mentioning earlier, where your information is posted and timestamped to OSF, but it's not publicly available yet. So this is an option that you can use. If you do want to make that registration public immediately, I will say this is always the option I use, so you are welcome to use this option if it works with your goals as well. It will make that posted as soon as either all of your collaborators have accepted. So if you put additional collaborators on your template as well as an author, they will need to check it. Or after a certain waiting period of time has passed, it will then be automatically posted. So there is a brief waiting period there. I mentioned that because to fully follow the ethical guidelines and the spirit of a pre-registration, you do need to wait for that pre-registration to be fully posted after that waiting period before data collection starts. So I say that to mean that if you click submit, there may be another 24 or 48 hours or so before you actually will want to begin data collection, but that will be very clear to you on the OSF website. So you'll be able to keep track of that as well. If that is time sensitive, that's just going to be one of those cases where you're going to want to reach out to collaborators and emphasize how important it is to go ahead and accept that before waiting for that waiting period to pass. All right, so if you choose to make that registration publicly immediately, you can go ahead and create a DOI for that. You will want to go ahead and do that now so that it's already established within your pre-registration at that moment when you create that initial timestamp. All right, so that brings us to the end of our presentation here. We wanted to leave some time for you all to answer or to bring up any other questions that you may have about the pre-registration process, how it relates to open science. But also, we'd like to welcome you to go to the Open Science Framework website, choose one of these templates that we've showed to you today, or one of the ones that you're curious about. Play around with it and see what questions are coming up as you begin answering those. We'll be available here on the Q&A session here. Also, feel free to unmute yourself and just ask us a question at this point. And anyone here with us in person, we're more than happy to come over and look at your screens with you.
I do want to throw out one other thing, which is that OSF will allow you to do an anonymous pre-registration and an anonymous open science framework page. And I bring that up because when you're submitting to journals, often you will have a double-blind peer review where your name's not supposed to be attached to it. So on both the pre-registration and any other larger OSF page, there is an option to make an anonymous DOI where you can obviously not have your name attached to it, and that might be necessary for when you submit to a journal. It is also worth noting that in the writing of the paper, you might write out your analyses as in line with your pre-registration, and then a reviewer might ask you to do some other additional analyses, and you can say, we ran XYZ analyses in line with our pre-registration, and then further analyses external to our pre-registration or that were exploratory, so that you're able to fulfill the requests of the reviewers and still be in line with your pre-registration as well. Just want to throw that out there because that does come up a little bit later, but interact with the pre-registration process.
Great point. So just in case there is anyone who may not be as curious about this workshopping component of this, we do have some suggested readings to leave you off with as well. So here are some suggested readings, including that NOSIC article that Neela brought up right at the beginning of our presentation. And aside from that, we're happy to answer any questions that you may have.
So someone like the last step, if someone ordered to like create the DOI, right, can they do it later or how is the procedure?
Yes, you are able to create the DOI later. And in the same way, you can create a public DOI and a anonymous DOI. I believe they're separate things. So when you're submitting things, double check that. But yes, it doesn't need to be created as you click publish. It can be done after the fact, I believe, just in the settings on OSF.
That will be dependent on the outlet that you're curious for too. Regardless of if you choose this DOI option, it will automatically create a very short and shareable link, like an osf./ something. And you'll be able to use that functionally as a DOI as well, depending on the outlet.
You could also, if you had to, create a second pre-registration for the same project, list that out. If the specific platform that's common in your field doesn't let you create a DOI after the fact, you can list out that it's a copy of it to create the DOI.
Can type the
Yes, if you had to, so some of these platforms are more or less sophisticated than others. So a lot of them, most of the ones that I've interacted with let you create the DOI later. But if you absolutely had to, and you're on a platform that didn't let you do it, which a lot of these are on older websites, you could put all the same information again, or if you had to, a lot of them have a button to create a copy of it. And you could do that, click the DOI button, and right towards the top, this is a copy of XYZ that was submitted on this date, created for the purpose of creating the DOI.
Yeah, another option that would be coming to mind if you're trying to like troubleshoot through that specific instance would be you could export the current version, which would include those timestamps, and then use the most general open format, like the least templated template available, and just simply upload that with like as a standalone PDF for that page, or a PDF along with a reasoning page where you just have a couple sentences describing why that's the case and perhaps linking them back to that original just so that they have proof of that timestamp.
I'm reading over the question that was just set about if it's set to anonymous. At first glance, I'm not sure of what this is asking, and that's probably on me.
So it sounds like you might be asking if the OSF is set to be anonymous, is it still traceable back to you as the author whenever it's past peer review? So once it does not need to be blind anymore, are you able to make it like unanonymous? So my understanding to this would be yes, it would be,
I think that it's separate DOIs. So I think.
yes, the link will change.
Yes.
Yes.
So you would have a DOI that goes in to the manuscript submitted to the journal when it's blinded. And then in the editing process, once it's been accepted and the title page is now attached to the manuscript, you'd add the public DOI. I believe there's entirely separate DOIs used to reference the anonymous versus the non-anonymous one.
What other questions are you guys curious about? We're happy to answer any of these more like functional logistical questions as well. Wonderful. Well, as you're approaching your first pre-registration, feel free to find our names and email through this original site where you'll also be able to then access the slides and this workshop recording. Feel free to reach out to us. We'd be happy to help any of you throughout our consulting role at ISC, where we can help you with either answering specific questions for your pre-registration, give perhaps a power analysis that you need help running, or we're able to be that second set of eyes for you and read your pre-registration draft with a statistical lens.
Vein, a lot of times you have a general plan of analysis that you have set up for your pre-registration and for your study, but you have a couple other studies or a couple other questions that you don't know exactly what analysis that you want to do and you want to get your pre-registration done. That's another time to touch base with a statistical consultant or with your principal investigator, so on and so forth. And then you're a little bit more ready for the data collection and data analysis stage, and that's really the benefit of pre-registration is getting all set up for that.
Thank you.